My wife tells a story of how, when she was in high school, she and her friends would talk about taking the driving test. A booklet from the DMV contained everything a driver ought to know, and in theory, anything in that booklet could be the subject of a question on the written test. With 10 questions, you had to get at least 7 correct to pass, so there was intense interest in what those questions might be. Teenagers who'd taken the test were sought out to share their experience. Reports of tougher questions inevitably raised a school's collective anxiety, while mention of easier questions was more calming. One question, according to student law, was the subject of intense focus, a gimme question that every teenager prayed to see on their test sheet. What does a red octagonal sign mean? Anyone who was so unprepared, or I guess so freaked out beyond ordinary nervousness that they couldn't answer that question, probably didn't deserve to get their driving license. I share this with you because, other than having taken the driving test myself, I've experienced a parallel situation in my own life as part of my preparation for the Unitarian Universalist ministry. Equivalent in many ways to the DMV, the primary gatekeeper for would-be ministers is the MFC, the Ministerial Fellowship Committee, that interviews newly minted seminarians to see if they're ready to serve congregations. Rather than some hours behind the wheel of a car, the MFC's interviews have worked in hospitals with experienced chaplains and in congregations with experienced ministers. Rather than the driver's manual, the would-be ministers are expected to be familiar with everything they learned in seminary classes, with everything they experienced in workshops and trainings, and with everything they read on the MFC's extensive book list. And finally, rather than a written test of 10 questions, the interview generally lasts 50 minutes to an hour or more, with many more than 10 questions, and definitely no multiple choice answers. And yet there's still a gimme question. I was asked it as part of a set of quick answer questions, and it was as follows. What is the Cambridge platform? I'm glad I wasn't so unprepared or so freaked out beyond ordinary nervousness that I couldn't answer that question. Rather, I said briefly and correctly, it's the founding document of our congregational polity. Now, I'm going to explain what that means, but first, let's have a quick show of hands, at least those of you I can see on screen at any given time. Who here has heard of the Cambridge platform before? Okay, some of you are putting your hands up. Good. Who had heard of it before reading about it in the UUA report, Widening the Circle of Concern? Fewer hands. Okay, harder question. Who has read the Cambridge platform? I see a couple of hands. Good. Good. Well, that's fair enough. It was written over 370 years ago, and it's a bit of a slog. It's also heavily Christian, including over 300 references to the Bible. So putting that aside, let me explain what the Cambridge platform is before I explain what this piece of Puritan history has to do with us. As Peter Hughes, UU minister and editor of the online Dictionary of Unitarian and Universalist Biography, explains it, the Cambridge platform is both a declaration of religious independence and an ecclesiastical constitution, adopted well over a century before the corresponding political documents that marked the founding of the United States of America. You see, the churches of 17th century New England sought to define the ways in which they would govern themselves, free of interference by outside authorities such as the Church of England. That's the Declaration of Religious Independence bit. And with each parish free to govern itself. That's the Ecclesiastical Constitution bit. After all, the Puritans who came to New England were seeking the freedom to organize themselves in order to be authentic Christians as they understood what that meant. And given that the Puritans' understanding of religion differed from that of the British Crown and the bishops of the Church of England, they looked to the Bible for guidance and to the New World as a place for their self-governing congregations. Now, set aside what you've heard about the Puritans and listen to how Alice Blair Wesley, UU minister and historian, describes them. These Congregationalists understood the Bible to be mainly about the free and covenanted social practice of love. As they understood church history, the substance of a free church has always been the same: the Holy Spirit of mutual love. The living, gathered bodies of the members are the matter of the free church. Its form, the covenantal promise, defines the membership, determines its organizational structure, and imbues the church with promise, the potential to be a life-giving organization in the larger world. I don't know about you, but that sounds rather Unitarian Universalist to me, and there's a good reason for that. In the centuries following the creation of the Cambridge Platform, Unitarianism emerged as a distinct form of Congregationalism. As it happened, the independently originated Universalists organized themselves congregationally too. That's why when the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America consolidated in 1961, they adopted a polity, which is simply an academic word meaning a structure of organization and governance. They adopted a specifically congregation-centered polity that is directly descended from the Cambridge Platform. Now, usually when I say that Unitarianism is directly descended from the Puritans, I see a lot of people do a double take, since it's quite a surprise to hear that our liberal faith could have anything to do with what we generally imagine to have been an oppressive and soul-crushing religion. The Puritans, though, made a particular choice in deciding how to practice their religion, and that choice allowed, perhaps inevitably, for what we might call faith creep. You see, the Cambridge Platform clearly emphasized the importance of covenant, how the Puritans were to be together and behave toward one another, rather than creed, what it was they believed in the usual sense of the word faith. As Wesley puts it, only each member's promise, made freely and individually, to walk together with other members in the ways of love, makes the people a free church. Different people with different beliefs might not be able to agree on a common creed, but that doesn't mean we can't covenant with one another to find the ways of love as best we can see to do. The Cambridge Platform even has something that might sound to our ears an awful lot like a statement of freedom of belief, since it explains that the voluntary agreement of the covenant isn't about faith in the heart, since nobody else can see that, nor the profession of faith, since that doesn't necessarily specify to which particular church someone belongs, nor even cohabitation, since in the words of the document itself, even atheists and infidels may dwell together with believers. The problem, at least for the Puritans, but a blessing for we Unitarian Universalists, is that a community based on covenant is more flexible and accommodating than a community based on creed. In other words, variations in belief that would fail the test of orthodoxy might be okay so long as the unorthodox believer is still capable of meeting together to find the ways of love, knowing that there is always more to learn about how love really works and could work in our lives and in the world. It was probably only a matter of time then before some of those Congregationalists took a closer look at their Bibles and realized that the doctrine of the Trinity isn't really there, hence Unitarianism, or asked why an all-loving God would condemn any finite human soul to infinite punishment in hell, hence Universalism. It took 3 centuries for those strands to come together and form Unitarian Universalism, but it's why we are a covenantal church, not a creedal church. It's why our denominational covenant, better known as the 7 principles and 6 sources, begin with the words, "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote." But at the other end of the principles and sources, there's a sentence we tend to forget about. As free congregations, we enter into this covenant, promising to one another our mutual trust and support. You see, the Cambridge Platform defined congregational churches as being independent of external authorities, but it also established a community in which those churches were bound in relationship with one another. There were a number of ways in which congregational churches were expected to be in communion with one another, including sharing expertise, helping one another in cases of financial difficulty or ministerial illness, and convening neighboring churches to help return a troubled congregation to covenant. So to recap, here's how the Reverend Dr. Natalie Fenimore, member of the Commission on Institutional Change that authored the UUA report, Widening the Circle of Concern, here's how Dr. Fenimore explains it. On the individual level, our congregationalism gives authority and responsibility to each member of our congregations and communities, and it is a proclamation of their worth and dignity. It says, you are needed, you are valuable, you are central to the process of making a Unitarian Universalist community. There is nothing unless you make it. The power of the individual member of our congregational and covenanted community is best held with humility, Dr. Fenimore continues. We are asked to recognize that our power is shared with other individuals and with those called as partners in leadership within our communities. This is the dance of congregationalism, sharing leadership, recognizing when individuals are best in position to lead or to move back, and making space for new ideas, change, and transformation. Our Congregationalist ancestors balanced the relationships of authority and responsibility between individual church members, between the congregation and the minister, and between each other. They recognized, Dr. Fenimore concludes, the tug between autonomy and fellowship that is inherent in our polity as we do it today. In other words, all of this is about being in relationship. Individual members of congregations with one another, members of congregations with ministers, and congregations with each other. When I became a UU, back at the dawn of the 21st century, Unitarian Universalism had all but forgotten its heritage as a religion based in covenant. We knew we didn't have a creed, and even the 7 principles and 6 sources seemed too much like a creed for some UUs. But in forgetting our heritage, we became the religion where you can believe whatever you want. The church of anything goes. Our courageous intention to welcome everyone, whoever they are, mutated into a shameful willingness to turn a blind eye to whatever people might do, whether someone's behavior be discomforting, rude, or even threatening. From some of the stories I've heard, it's actually amazing that Unitarian Universalism survived the 70s and the 80s. We've come a long way since then. 20 years later, covenant is everywhere you look, from religious education classes to fellowship circles. The policy board and a number of committees have covenants too. which are all worded very differently, but are all ultimately about how we intend to bring our best selves to our work together. But covenant isn't just the vital force within a congregation. It's also the vital force between congregations. 10 years ago, I did a little bit of modern circuit riding, and I preached in Norfolk and in Williamsburg and at the UUFP that it was time to take seriously the idea of a cluster, a local group of congregations working together just as the Cambridge platform described. As it says in chapter 15, although congregations are distinct and are not therefore confused with one another, and equal, and do not therefore have dominion one over another, yet all congregations ought to preserve their communion, one with another, because they are all united, not only in mystery, but also in polity. And it goes on to list a number of ways that distinct and equal congregations should work together, the sorts of ways that UU congregations continue to work together. The UUFP, for instance, has benefited twice from a Chalice Lighters program that collects small gifts of money from lots of UUs across the Southeast, each time adding up to more than $20,000. Another long-standing tradition is that I will occasionally swap pulpits with colleagues, as I'm doing with the Williamsburg UU's minister, the Reverend Laura Horton Ludwig, and with the Coastal Virginia UU's minister, the Reverend Viola Abbott, this spring. And thanks to a meeting that we first held at the UUFP almost 10 years ago, there is now a Tidewater cluster of UU congregations from Fredericksburg down to Virginia Beach, and there's also a Blue Ridge cluster on the western side of the state. But I want more. And Dr. Fenimore and the other members of the Commission on Institutional Change who wrote Widening the Circle of Concern clearly want more too. Based on its 4 years of work, the commissioners wrote that congregations lack a covenantal understanding with one another and with the UUA, which is critical to the effectiveness of congregational polity. Congregational leaders may use the idea of congregational polity to maintain an organizational independence that discourages them from joining with other congregations in the work of equity and justice. Reading this blunt assessment in the report hit me hard, but it also opened my eyes. Thanks perhaps to that distaste for covenant instilled by preachers like Jonathan Edwards and other revivalists who believed that they could induce spiritual experiences through fear. First, the Unitarians and then the Unitarian Universalists forgot about the backbone of what it means to be a liberal church. As a result, we UUs are very good at being independent, making our own decisions, setting our own budgets, electing our own leaders, calling our own ministers, but we've tended to forget that congregationalism isn't so much about independent churches as it is about interdependent churches. I'm proud of the work that we did 10 years ago that created the Tidewater cluster, but it's time for more. I mean, right from the start, the cluster got to work organizing an annual meeting, our own local mini General Assembly with worship and keynotes and workshops and lunch with fellow UUs from across Virginia, and that was great. Being together, spending time with one another, catching up with old friends and making new friends, that's all good. But we never talked about why. We never talked about why we were doing this as UUs. We never talked about what difference it made that we were UUs doing this. I mean, there are lots of other groups and clubs that bring people together around some common interest or concern, but we are not just any other group or club. We are Unitarian Universalists, a religion with a 400-year history, not just a faith, but a faith in action with a practical theology based in covenant. If that basis is missing, are we still UUs? My pitch for the Tidewater cluster hasn't changed much from my pitch to create it 10 years ago. Consider what we might learn from one another about congregational growth or leadership development or stewardship, I suggested. Think about what we might achieve together as anti-racism allies or collaborative green sanctuaries or cooperating welcoming congregations, I encouraged. Imagine what we might get out of combined youth group heritage trips or multi-congregation camps or joint choir festivals, I urged. All of that and more is what the cluster could be. I mean, why should every congregation, no matter how small, have to figure out payroll on its own? So all of that and more is what the cluster could be, and yet we haven't moved beyond a limited once-a-year or less frequent gathering. I believe that the reason for that is that we have never talked about doing this from a place of UU identity. We never drew upon our rich tradition and practical theology of covenant. So I'm starting a new campaign. I'm responding to the assessment of the Commission on Institutional Change by talking with my colleagues about the fact that we need to hold congregational conversations about what it means to be in covenant with one another. Just as all UU congregations have made a covenant with one another to be the UU Association of Congregations, so too do the 7 congregations in the Tidewater cluster need to make a covenant about being the Tidewater cluster, and probably in more practical and directly applicable terms than the 7 principles too. The fact is that none of us should be having to do this work alone. It's too important and also too hard for each congregation to be trying to go it alone, inventing the wheel 7 times when we only need to invent it once and could put the rest of that energy to much better use. In the words of Widening the Circle of Concern, our covenant calls us to hold urgent and dear Unitarian Universalism's aspirations to building the beloved community with diversity, inclusion, equity, compassionate justice, and an acknowledgement of our interdependence with other forms of life. We have bound ourselves together in faithful discernment, not just by structure, but in our learning and living. Our common ministry must lead us forward toward transformation and liberation. We are called to travel this path together, because together we are more. We are called to travel this path together, because together we are more, both within congregations and between congregations. Let's do this.